How do we in the church today tend to hear these stories of the Old Testament differently than the original audiences would have heard the stories? I think we need to consider how our context and our response to the scriptures is different than
All
the
right.
folks in the Old Testament era.
I'll show that I'm a preacher in part by having 3 points like I just had 3 points
Okay.
with the
Do you have a poem as well to go with it?
first one is that the words, we don't really hear the word plays. Like, for example, the birthright story with Jacob, and the Hebrew root is BRK. So that's the birthright. Now, when Jacob comes back and he meets Esau, it says he gave him a present. The root is the same, BRK. So in other words, he was giving it back to him in grace. Not that he gave back the birthright, but he was giving back a present that was in place of the birthright, that brought the brothers together. Now, you can't capture that in translation. That's one way they differ. The other way
So,
is,
excuse me,
yeah,
so a person who is reading the Hebrew would pick up on that literary connection,
right.
and we lose that literary connection in English.
That's right. Or even like you cannot serve God and mammon. We don't capture that mammon. And the reason is that even it's an Aramaic word. And what's interesting is that the whole narrative is in Greek, but they kept the Aramaic word. Why did they keep the Aramaic word? Because it communicated a person that what the NIV did, it put money in capital letter to say, you have a relationship to this God. But it's very hard to capture that. And even the New Testament had trouble capturing the Aramaic, and they just kept the Aramaic word. And that's why the King James is mammon. But the average reader cannot understand that. So we have that limitation. But that's where the exposit comes in. That's why God's given teachers to the church to help us to understand these things. So
Okay, so one difference would be language.
one difference is language. Another difference is it has to do with the culture, the world in which they lived. They knew the places. Uh, Today, fortunately, with the Middle East crisis, for the first time, the church is learning where Mesopotamia is, where Iraq is, and they're learning a little bit about the culture by just looking at the Middle East and listening to the language of the Middle East. So the culture, and I think that even in the early chapters of Genesis, you have to understand they lived in the midst of other creation stories. And so they knew that where they were in Babylon, for example, the god of creation was Marduk. But the Bible is using very similar language there to say, no, it's not Marduk. It's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that made this world.
So we have a difference in language, difference in culture with that original audience. What would be the third difference?
I think the difference is that they had a better awareness of the covenant that we'd been talking about. In other words, you can't evaluate these stories unless you know the covenant. One of the books I teach is the book of Judges. And you have the story of Israel conquering Jebus, Jerusalem. And Adonai-Bezek is the king of Jerusalem. And then they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And as he says, as I have done to 70 of my enemies, God has done to me. Now, numbers of commentators think Adonai-Bezek is a great guy because he says, God did this to me. He understands what we call lex talionis, justice, and so forth. But because they don't know covenant, in Deuteronomy 7, the Bible said, show no mercy, that they should have exterminated the evil. That is the beginning of the decline of Israel, right there. They didn't keep it perfectly, It was reasonable, but it's a very small step. The first compromise is you beginning the slide of apostasy. And from there to the end of the story, finally, they are a Levite, a priest, is taking his concubine and cutting her up into 12 pieces. I mean, that's where it began. But unless you understand the covenant of Deuteronomy 7, you really will misinterpret that story, as many commentators do, because they don't know the Bible well enough.
So what happens at that point is they do something that seems generally appropriate, but they are not careful with the Word of God in terms of the details. And even though they're doing things that are religious and seem to be done in the name of God and His agenda, because they are not careful with God's words, then they start down a trail that's not a healthy place to be.
See, it's interesting the way the narrator tells it, because the king says, as I have done. This is Canaanite, not Israelite. And he showed mercy, relative, cutting off thumbs and big toes. But nevertheless, he says, as I have done, God has done to me, which shows it's the beginning of the Canaanization. And as Daniel Block puts it, that's what the book is all about, is the Canaanization of Israel. And I see it in the church today. We're making small compromises, but we're becoming more and more like the world all the time because we don't have a clear-cut edge to it.
I think about the phrase over and over again in the Pentateuch, all the words of this law, all the words of this law. The emphasis on following fully the details of what God has laid out.
And I think there's a weakness here because we have dismissed the law because Israel misused the law. The average Christian has no idea what the law is about because he's been indoctrinated into thinking the law is done away. But the law represents eternal values to us. And the new covenant enables us to live out those values. But I think that we've made a big mistake in the church because we don't teach the law, because we're afraid of legalism. We're afraid of becoming like the Pharisees. We've become that way without the law.